All right, welcome everybody. So this is the Ethics of Love and Marriage class. Today what we're going to be doing is going over the things on the list there. We'll talk about the syllabus and expectations. We'll talk about what a logical argument is. We'll talk about truth and relativism, a little bit about philosophy and theology, and about science and faith if we have time for that. I'm not sure we will, but we'll see. I want to talk a little bit about something called relativism. So it's the idea that truth is subjective, that there are several truths that oppose each other, or put another way, is that there is no truth. So there's a relativism view, and then there's what you might call non-relativism, and they have to do with rival answers to the question, can we know the truth? So a relativist is going to say, we really can't know the truth. You have your truth, I have my truth, and we never can really discover what actually is the truth. Another way to think of it is the question, are all points of view equally valid? So the relativist would say yes, and the non-relativist would say no. Or another question would be, is right and wrong merely a matter of opinion? Is it a little bit like, I don't know, your taste in food? You like pizza, somebody else hates pizza. Well, there's no real right or wrong. It's just sort of what you feel and what you enjoy or something. So relativism and non-relativism are going to give different answers to these perspectives. Now, before we get into relativism and non-relativism, I want to talk about a basic logical argument. So in philosophy, we use arguments sometimes to try to understand things. And so an argument has three parts: a major premise, for example, all men are mortal; a minor premise, like Socrates is a man; and then you have the conclusion, Socrates is mortal. Now, if you want to disagree with that conclusion, that's perfectly fine. But in philosophy, at least, what you do is you criticize the argument. And so you might say, for instance, that one or more of the terms is not clear or is ambiguous. So one of the tests is, are all the terms clear and unambiguous? Does men mean the same thing in both premises? Does Socrates mean the same thing, etc.? Secondly, are all the premises true? So another way an argument can fail is to have one or both premises be false. And then finally, is the argument logically valid? And there's whole classes taught on, what makes an argument valid, and we can't go into all that. But the basic idea is you could have two true premises and a conclusion, but the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises. So like if I were to say to you, all the men in this class are LMU students, all the women in this class are LMU students, therefore all the men in this class are women, well, that would be an invalid argument. Even though both premises were true, the conclusion doesn't follow. So, what is truth? What is truth? There's different definitions given, but one definition or one possibility is the one given by Aristotle. And Aristotle said this. He said that truth is the correspondence of mind and reality. So, a statement is true if in reality that statement corresponds to reality. Truth, in other words, is a correspondence between your mind, what you believe, and reality. And so falsehood is the opposite. That would be where what you believe does not, in fact, correspond to reality. Now, this idea of truth is something that people might deny. You could say, look, there is no truth. And by truth, what you mean is what Aristotle said. In other words, there's no sense in which the mind corresponds to reality. We can't know reality, right? And if we couldn't know reality, well, then there would be no truth. Or if there was no reality. So relativism says things like, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. Now, in one sense, that's totally unproblematic in the sense that obviously there are some things that are just true for me and not true for you. My birthday is July 25th. So it's true for Albina that her birthday is July 15th. It's true for me, my birthday is July 25th. So it's not true for both of us that it's July 15th. So there's lots of statements like that. And that's not a problem for the non-relativist. In other words, non-relativism is making a different and a stronger claim. Not just that there's some personal truths for each one of us, like what we like to eat or when our birthday is or the name of our mom, but that everything is like that. That's the strong relativist view. Non-relativism would say, well, look, if it's true for you, it's true for everyone. So in other words, if in fact Albina really was born on the day she said. Well, then that's true. It's true for everyone that Albina was born on this day. It's not relative. And if you say Albina was born on July or on December 25th, that would be an example of a false statement. It doesn't correspond to reality. In fact, she was not born on that day. So how can we decide which view is correct, right? We have the relativism view. There's no truth. What's true for you is not true for me, etc. Or a non-relativist view. Well, let's think about it a little bit. One problem philosophers have raised for relativism is called self-referential incoherence. And I want to give you an example of some statements that are self-referentially incoherent. If I were to say, I'm not speaking English right now, that's an example of a self-referentially incoherent statement or a self-defeating statement. If I were to say, I never say the word never, that is also a self-defeating statement. Why? Well, because I just said the word never several times. And so it's also true that to say there is no truth is itself a self-defeating statement. Like if you say there's no absolutes, well, is that an absolute? Or if you said no one can know the truth about religion, well, how did you come to know this truth about religion? Or we can't know the truth about God. How did you come to know this truth about God? So you can see these are all examples of self-defeating statements. But another one is this: there is no truth, or no proposition is true. Those are self-defeating statements. Sir Roger Scruton said, a writer who says there are no truths, or that all truth is merely relative, is asking you not to believe him. So don't. Here's another problem for relativism. Let's say you have an argument that looks like this. The conclusion is there is no truth. But what would be the major premise that would justify that, and the minor premise that would justify that? What would be the major premise you would bring to justify that conclusion? What would be the minor premise you'd bring to justify that conclusion? So the conclusion is there's no truth. And what I'm asking you to do is think of some major premise and some minor premise that would justify that conclusion. The major premise is psychology shows that everyone's perspective is different. And then the minor premise is if everyone's perspective is different, there's no truth. The conclusion then is that there's no truth. Does this argument work? Or is there a problem with this argument? If you have, for instance, a discovery in science, everyone in the whole world doesn't know it yet. And then at one point, there's only one person who knows about it, whoever discovers the whatever, penicillin or whatever. So you have lots of cases where there are things that are true, and yet everyone's perspective maybe for a while was different from that. So just because people think something doesn't mean it actually is the case. That seems right. If you hold that it's true that psychology shows everyone's perspective is different, well, then the conclusion can't be correct. On the other hand, if you hold the conclusion is correct, then that major premise has to be not true. The same things with the minor premise. If you hold it's true that everyone's perspective is different, then there's no truth. Well, then the conclusion can't be correct. But if the conclusion is correct, then the minor premise can't be correct. The idea that all truths are relative would itself be a truth that isn't relative, if it were true. But it's self-defeating for the reasons I just described. So what is the point of this example? The point is that it's literally impossible to have a sound, logically valid argument that concludes there's no truth. For the reason I just showed, that any argument you ever gave would have to rely on premises, and any premises you ever gave, if it's going to be a good argument, have to be true premises. But if the conclusion's correct, there never could be, ever, any true premises that you could ever bring to justify that conclusion. So that position is a position that's not tenable. How about this one? All knowledge is socially constructed. Whatever is socially constructed is not true. So all knowledge is not true. Does that work? 2 + 2 is 4. Is that socially constructed? No. I mean, the words are, the fact that in English we say 2 + 2 is 4, and in German they say 2 und 2 ist 4. The words we use are socially constructed, but the idea that if you have 2 apples, say, and 2 apples, then now you have 4 apples, That's not socially constructed. In other words, if there were no human beings on planet Earth, it still would be the case that 2 apples and 2 apples are 4 apples, right? That doesn't depend on us. If we all died tomorrow, it still would be the case. So there are things that are true, like 2 + 2 is 4, that don't depend on us. For instance, scientists just established that the universe is 13.77 billion years old. Now, a billion years ago, there were no human beings around at all, but there was still reality. There was stuff in existence. The sun existed, the universe existed, all kinds of things existed. So there were some things, some statements, no one said those statements, of course, but there'd be some propositions that were true even back then. Like say, the sun is hotter than ice. That doesn't depend on anyone knowing it. It is true independently of us. It's objectively true, you might say. Here's another problem for relativism, and that's the problem of living in the real world. Almost no one lives as if 2 + 2 is not 4. Even people who say they're relativists and everything's relative, they don't act as if that is really the case. They walk out the door, everyone other than insane people presupposes that certain things are true. Everybody basically acts on the presupposition that there are some things that are true and some things that are false. And here's one of those great suppositions. It's that a thing cannot be and not be at the same time in the same respect. Avicenna once said that anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction, that's this principle that a thing can't be and not be at the same time in the same respect, should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as not to be beaten, and to be burned is not the same as not to be burned. Yet another problem with relativism is cutting off questioning. So let's say, Jessica, you ask me a question like, Professor Kaiser, how did you get to be so stupid and ugly? Now, if you were to ask me that, I wouldn't take that question to be an actual question. In other words, if you said to me, why are you so stupid and ugly? And I replied, well, when I was a baby, my mom dropped me on my head and therefore I'm really stupid now. And I mean, it's not a real question, it's an insult. If you say to somebody, how'd you get so stupid and ugly? You're not really inquiring about anything. But let's say I ask you a real question. So let's say I ask Melissa, what is your favorite activity to do? What do you love to do more than anything else? I asked her a real question, and I did not know what the truth was. Maybe she'd say, I love eating more than anything. Maybe she'd say she loves reading Jane Austen novels more than anything. I don't know her. I didn't know what she was going to say. So she says hanging out with friends. Now that answer is true if and only if, in fact, in reality, and I don't have any way to check this, so I'm just taking her word for it, she really does like hanging out with friends. And I assume that she's telling me the truth. So if you're going to have a real question, not a rhetorical question like how'd you get so ugly, but a real question, if there's no truth, you couldn't have a real answer because there would be no truth. And if there's no truth, it doesn't make sense to ask any real questions. All you'd have is rhetorical questions. So part of the problem of relativism is that it cuts off questioning because it makes the point of asking questions, like finding out the truth about Melissa and what she likes, it makes that impossible because there's no truth. There's nothing she could tell me that would be true. So it makes it meaningless and pointless to ask anyone any real question as opposed to just a rhetorical question. Moreover, some people criticize relativism for challenging and undermining tolerance. Now, if you're a non-relativist, you could say something like this. All people have dignity. All people have basic human rights. And so we should not kill people, say, just because they have different beliefs than we do. So that would be a position that would justify tolerance. But if relativism, if we take that for granted, well, then there is no truth. And so it's not true that all people have dignity. It's not true that we should respect everyone. You may not want to harm people that are different from you, but that's just like you saying, I don't like pepperoni on my pizza, or I don't like to wear jeans that are too tight. And there's all kinds of things you might like and just it's your preference, but there's no reason that the fact that you don't like pepperoni in your pizza should stop me from putting pepperoni in my pizza. So if there's no moral truth, if everything's really relative, then your claim, hey, you shouldn't beat people up just because they have a different view than you, is again like a claim, I like vanilla ice cream. And I can say, well, fine, you like vanilla ice cream, I don't. I like strawberries. Tough luck. I'm going to eat strawberry. Tough luck, I'm going to harm people that are different than me. So in this class, what we're going to do is try to figure out what the truth is. And I want to encourage you to avoid what's called the ad hominem fallacy. The ad hominem fallacy is when you criticize someone's view because of who they are. You're attacking the person rather than the argument. So for instance, if I say, oh, your view is wrong because of the color of your skin, or because you're a man, or because you're a woman, or because you're this, or because you're that, that's an example of an ad hominem fallacy. Rather than responding to your argument, I am just attacking you. Let's talk a little bit about scientism. Scientism is the view that science and science alone provides the truth. People who advocate scientism, they're not relativists. Now, can anyone see a problem with this scientism view? Can anyone see a difficulty with it? There are people who deny science, just like there's people who believe that Elvis is alive. Now, does it follow, though, that it isn't true that Elvis is dead, say? Or because there are science deniers, does it follow that it's really not, we don't really know whether or not basic scientific truths like the sun is hotter than ice cream are true? Science is a little bit like a metal detector. So say you're at the beach and you lose a ring, a metal ring. Having a metal detector is great because you can, go over where you were and hopefully you'll be able to find it with a metal detector. But if you're at the beach and you lost a diamond in the sand, a diamond is just not going to be detected by a metal detector. It's not designed to do that. Science is to detect the quantifiable, the measurable. But we shouldn't assume everything is quantifiable and everything is measurable. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. But we can't assume a priori that everything's quantifiable and everything's measurable. Because what if there are some things that aren't quantifiable and aren't measurable? Or things that can only be measured indirectly? Maybe there's such a thing like that. Maybe there isn't, but maybe there is. So if you think of science as a metal detector, you can say both, that science is very valuable, extremely important, especially if you lose metal ring on the beach, but also recognize that science is not perfect. So for instance, let's say you have this question: should I marry this person? I'm in love with this person. I'm thinking of marrying this person. Now, could science prove whether you should marry this person? Well, no. There's no scientific test that shows, oh, for sure you should marry so-and-so. Just like there's no scientific test that proves whether an action is morally good or morally bad. Science is all about what is the case, not about what ought to be the case. So scientism is problematic for that reason, but it's also problematic for another reason, that this is another example of a self-defeating statement. The idea that science and science alone provides the truth. So when you use the Bunsen burners and mixed up a couple chemicals, did it ever, like a cloud of smoke, come out and say science alone provides the truth? Like, no, it didn't. Okay. Well, how about in biology? Did you ever do like some dissections? You ever dissect like a frog or something like that? When you dissected the frog, did you ever like look behind the liver or whatever, and then there's a little ribbon that said science alone provides the truth? You guys have all taken science classes. Have you ever been in the science class, physics or any science class, where the science class showed that science and science alone provides the truth? Okay, well, if there's no scientific evidence that science and science alone provides the truth, well, then this is another example of a self-defeating statement. If it's a self-defeating statement, well, we ought not to accept it. So we can reasonably believe many things without scientific proof. For example, logical truths, mathematical truths, metaphysical truths, like a whole is greater than its part, historical truths, like the universe is more than 5 minutes old, that other minds exist, that the external world exists, and ethical truths, like racism is wrong or rape is wrong. All those are things we can reasonably believe, even though we may not have scientific proof of those things. Again, that's not to put down science. Science is super important, but just to say that science is a tool that is not the right tool for every occasion. In this class, what we're going to be doing is looking at issues around love and marriage to try to get wisdom for greater insight for life. What we're going to do is look at a bunch of different issues. So first I want to ask you about this one. Does living together prior to marriage reduce the likelihood of divorce? Is that true? Is that false? What do you guys think? So we're going to be later in the semester spending a whole class talking about cohabitation. Living together prior to marriage does not reduce, but actually increases the likelihood of divorce. And some studies say increases it by about 80%. And so we'll talk about a lot of the data, not today, but in a future class. Some of the surprising data includes that the longer a couple lives together, the higher their likelihood of divorce. So couples like Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, who lived together, I think for 9 years before they got married and then got divorced like 2 years after that, that actually is not uncommon. The longer you live together, the higher your likelihood of divorce. So anyway, we'll talk a lot about that moving on. But how about this? 50% of marriages in the US end in divorce. Is that true? Is that false? It actually is false. Yeah, and that's one of the reasons I like teaching this course is a lot of people have misconceptions about their likelihood of divorcing. If you are getting married for the first time and you're getting married to somebody else who's getting married for the first time, your likelihood of divorcing is about 42%. Now, if you are if you've had some college, which you have, obviously you're in this class, and the person you're marrying has had some college, again, not graduating college, but just been to college, that lowers your likelihood of divorce by another about 15%. I'm going to talk in the course of the semester about many things that you can choose to do to lower your likelihood of divorce quite substantially. And that's part of the reasons I think this course is so important, because it really is, for most people at least, quite an unpleasant experience to get divorced, especially if kids are involved. It's very expensive. And again, I think almost no one chooses to get married and then wants to get divorced. Now, the good news in part, though, is that divorce is actually at a 50-year low right now. Divorce is lower now than it's been since the early 1970s, when no-fault divorces were made available. I'm going to talk to you in this semester about many things that you can do to lower your likelihood of divorce even further. How about this question? Couples with children are more likely to divorce. Is that true? Is that false? What do you think? Are kids going to keep you from getting married or keep you from getting divorced, or is it irrelevant? Well, it's interesting. There was a study done with the United Nations that basically looked at not just America, but all over the world. Like I think it was 120 societies or something. It was like a huge worldwide study. And basically what it found is that couples that have no kids worldwide had about a 37% likelihood of divorce. And then with one kid, it dropped to like 20%, and 2 kids, it dropped to like 17%. And 4 or more kids, they had only a 3% likelihood of divorce. So basically, and this was something Aristotle argued too, that children are a kind of glue that actually hold couples together and make it much less likely to divorce. Part of the reason is that if you love your kids, which most people do, you have an extra reason to love your husband or your wife, because this person's not just your husband or your wife. This person also is the mother or father of your kids. And so you have this extra incentive to work hard, to try to be your best self, to, if there's a problem, to patch it up, because it's not just about you two. It's also about your kids. And even though right at the moment you might be really unhappy with your spouse, presumably you still love your kids. And so you want to work it out. How about this one? Romantic sparks are the key to long-term marital happiness. Is that right? Is that wrong? Yeah, the psychological research on this is pretty strong, that actually the key, you might say, the most important thing isn't so much the romantic spark or the sexual connection or something like that, but rather the friendship that exists between the spouses. And part of the reason for that is that most of your life as a spouse is not, you might spend on romantic activities. I mean, most of life is like, getting milk and whatever, taking care of the kids and cleaning the car and whatever. And that basically, it turns out that if you do want ongoing long-term romantic spark, that the best way to do that is actually through kindness and kind of everyday, nice, friendly things that you might do. So sometimes people think, well, if a relationship's in trouble, the best thing to do is take a trip to Hawaii. like you're on the beach and everything's romantic and amazing. But the thing is, if you have a kind of rocky relationship, it doesn't matter where you are, right? You could be in Hawaii, you could be wherever, and it's going to be rocky and not that fun. And so much more important is sort of everyday service, everyday kindness, everyday listening, being involved in a kind of ongoing way like that. That's actually much more important than, being super hot, super beautiful. And another way to think about it is we all know of super hot, super beautiful people who obviously are, movie stars and beautiful, and yet they get divorced, right? So clearly it can't be just being incredibly hot is all you need and everything's going to be great. There's some couples that are more secular and some couples that are more religious. And what they found basically is that if you're extremely secular and if you're extremely religious, those tend to be very egalitarian marriages. So for instance, very religious husbands do tons of housework and tons of childcare and help out around the house and things like that. Where people don't do very much is actually that basically, and it kind of makes sense because if you think of a religious view as something like you're supposed to love God and you're supposed to love your spouse, and you serve God through serving your spouse. Well, if that's the way you think of it, then you'd expect, say, the husband and the wife, for that matter, to be eager to serve the other person and help the other person. So like a religious husband would say, hey, I want to serve God, and I do that in part by serving my wife. So I want to try to help her and like go to the store and get milk and just whatever. I mean, help her out. And likewise, she would try to help him out. The older you are when marrying, the lower your likelihood of divorce. Is that true? Is that not true? False? Not false? So this is a tricky question. The research shows basically this, that if you're past the age of 32 or so, the odds of divorce increase by about 5% per year of marriage. So basically, if you get married very young, you're 19, then your likelihood of divorce is quite high. But if you get married later, your likelihood of divorce actually also goes up. So we'll talk later about statistically the age at which you are most likely to have a successful, happy marriage. We'll talk about that in a future class. Here's another question for you. Women with a college education are less likely to get married. It turns out this is false, that women with a college degree are much more likely to get married. It's women that have dropped out of high school, and particularly men who've dropped out of high school, that are very unlikely to get married. College-educated people are much more likely to get married. Marriage benefits men but harms women on average. That's false. Marriage helps both men and women quite substantially. Both men and women are more likely to live a longer life. Both are more likely to be healthy. Both are more likely to be wealthy. Both are more likely to have better relationships with extended family. So marriage is on average, greatly beneficial both for men and for women. How about cohabitation is just like marriage? We'll spend a whole class talking about cohabitation, as I said. The answer for this is that on average, if you compare cohabiting couples with married couples, there are very significant differences. So cohabiting couples are much more likely to break up, to engage in domestic violence, to have physical abuse of children, to have sexual abuse of children. Here's another statement. There's nothing a person can do to lower the likelihood of divorce. And we're going to talk in this class about many things, again, that you can choose to do. There's some things that are out of your control, but there are many things that you can choose to do to lower your likelihood of divorce. So you can think about it a little bit like this. Think about a fatal car accident. It could happen, it just happens to you, right? You just get run over and you die. But there's lots of things you can do to lower your likelihood of getting into a fatal car accident, like don't drive drunk, like don't drive too fast, like obey all the rules of the road, like get a safe car. And again, you could do all those things and still unfortunately get into an accident, true, but your likelihood is much, much, much lower if you do those things to lower your likelihood. So we're going to talk again in the semester about a lot of things that are in your power that you could do to lower your likelihood of divorce. We'll also talk in this semester about polygamy and monogamy and their social consequences. We'll spend a whole class talking about polygamy. And we'll talk a little bit about married couples, their sex lives. In fact, that on average, married couples don't have less sex, but have more sex than single people. And they don't have less satisfying sex, but they have more satisfying sex on average than single people do. We'll talk a little bit about the link between religious practice and the reduce of likelihood of divorce. So in philosophy, you have to provide reasons available in principle to any person for holding the views that you hold. So for instance, here's a philosophical argument. It's wrong to use human beings simply as an end to another's means. Stealing is using a human being simply as a means to someone's end, so stealing is wrong. This is a philosophical argument. On the other hand, this is a theological argument. God says, thou shalt not steal. Whatever God forbids is wrong, therefore stealing is wrong. So notice that both of these arguments have the same conclusion, right? Stealing is wrong. But one is a philosophical justification, and the other one's a theological justification. So to illustrate it again, here's a philosophical argument. It's wrong to break serious promises, such as marriage vows. Adultery breaks serious promises, therefore adultery is wrong. That's a philosophical argument. Here's a theological argument. God says, thou shalt not commit adultery. Whatever God forbids is wrong. Adultery is wrong. So this class is a philosophy class. So we're going to provide philosophical arguments. But sometimes philosophical arguments happen to coincide with theological arguments, as in this case. You could have a theological argument why adultery is wrong, and you could also have a philosophical argument why adultery is wrong. So in any case, that brings us to the end of today's class. Next time, we are going to talk about happiness.